Good afternoon or good evening if you're in the UK or somewhere else in the world. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And today, B.A. Paris is joining us to discuss her brand new book, The Therapist. And Gilly MacMillan is also joining us. And this isn't her most recent book, but this is one of the, you want to hold up your
Sure.
most recent book? There we go, To Tell You the Truth. And she's going to be doing the interview today. And Barbara is tuning in from her home office. And she'll be pitching in too, I'm sure. As always, I will be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for B.A. Paris or Gilly MacMillan or Barbara, go ahead and put them in and I'll reemerge at some point and I'll be happy to ask any questions that you might have. So anyway, over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Patrick. What a pleasure to meet you both on Zoom. Julie, and Bernadette. Is it all right if I call you Bernadette and not BA? Excellent. I'm a big fan of both their books. I've read them all, and I'm really delighted to have a chance to have a real conversation with them. I'm going to add that The Therapist is our July British Mystery Book of the Month. So while we sold out our original order, we still have more copies, and you are most welcome to order one. And Julie's book, when did your book publish, Julie? It was a while back.
It was last year, I believe, but the paperback's coming out soon, this summer, I think.
Wonderful. Anyway, it's really a treat to read modern contemporary British mystery. You know, I grew up on the golden age. I actually grew up at a time when I could read Agatha Christie in real time. So it's just great to see that excellent tradition be reinterpreted and continued. And to that end, Bernadette, I really love the idea that you have taken a really traditional Christie form and, you know, a really close circle of suspects in London in a particular configuration, and developed your story and your circle of suspects and so forth therein. For those of you who might be interested, who are writers and or readers who just want to be more informed, it would be very interesting for you to read Bernadette's this book, The Therapist, and then read the new Megan Miranda book, which we spoke about on Monday. I'm going to go blank here. This is a function of age. Bernadette, you just watched it. Can you remember the title?
A Quiet Place.
A Quiet Place, thank you. Yeah. And see how an American author and a British author take a very similar structure and interpret it differently. And I agree with Lee Child that you can take one idea and give it to many authors and you will always get many stories. They are never the same. But I think you might find it fascinating to see how the two actually work. So Gilly, I'm hoping that you might have some questions for Bernadette, and if you run dry, I'll pop in.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. Total pleasure to be here talking to you, Bernadette. I'm a complete fan of your books, and I have been since Behind Closed Doors. So it was completely thrilling to read The Therapist, and I absolutely loved it. What I thought I might do is kick off with a few questions about kind of how you got started writing, that kind of thing, just for anybody who doesn't know you or know your work, which is probably very few people. So one thing I noticed that you and I have in common is that our debut novels were published later in life. And I wondered, was it always an ambition of yours to write? Did you manage to write while you were working and raising a family? How did that fit in, or was it an impulse that sort of came to you later on?
It was definitely later on. I mean, I always wanted to write and I knew I would one day, but it was just the case of finding the time. As you know, when you've got children, it's impossible to gather a few hours for yourself. So it was always there at the back of my mind. And I started writing really when my two eldest daughters left home to go to university, and I had the three younger ones, and that just freed up some time for me. And I had mentioned to one of my daughters that I wanted to start writing, and she found a competition run by the Sunday Times for a novel. But my idea had been to write children's stories. So when she said, you know, Mummy, I think you could write a novel, I thought, no way, not 80,000 words. It just seemed so immense. But that night I went to bed and I had an idea for a story about a family, and it wasn't Behind Closed Doors. And the next day, I mean, I didn't even have a computer at this point. So I went and bought myself a computer and started writing this story, which of course didn't win. but I couldn't stop writing. It just gave me the bug, and I just started writing book after book after book and trying to get published. And eventually I found an agent for Behind Closed Doors.
Fantastic. And of course, Behind Closed Doors took off. I mean, your career in thriller writing started with an absolute bang. I remember, you know, we talk a lot about books you can't put down, and that was the definition of one. I read it in one sitting, still remember that. And I wanted to ask you how that felt for everything to take off so fast. I mean, there's always this myth about overnight success, and it always looks like that from the outside, and it clearly wasn't for you because you'd been writing and writing and writing. But what was it like to sort of burst onto the scene like that, and how's that felt in the aftermath?
The thing is, I don't think I really realised. I didn't feel that I had burst onto the scene. I was living in France at the time. I didn't know anything about the publishing world. You know, I wasn't on any form of social media. So when my book became this success, I wasn't actually really aware of it. And when my publisher was writing to me and saying, oh, you've sold this many copies, you know, I could tell she was excited about it. And I knew it was good, obviously, but I didn't realise just how good until they invited me back to London, and I walked into the office and there was champagne everywhere because I'd sold 500,000 copies. And this was only about 5 months after it came out. And I remember turning to my then editor, Sally, and saying, why is 500,000 copies good? And they kind of all fell around laughing, because I kind of presumed that most authors sold. I mean, I had no concept of figures. So now when I look back on it, I really feel that in a way it was good, because I was completely unaware. And a lot of it, I didn't have any interviews with anybody. I wasn't interviewed by any newspapers or any magazines, or, you know, maybe because I was living in France, and so I never really knew that I was that successful until maybe much later.
Do you think that was a blessing? Do you think it's that kind of naive? I suppose it's a sort of naivety. I was a bit similar when I started. I knew nothing, and yeah. Do you think it was a blessing, or you know?
Yeah, I think in retrospect it was a blessing, but sometimes I wish in a way I had known and experienced all the buzz, because I didn't feel that buzz at all. I mean, you know, I didn't even have the bookseller, so I didn't know it was at the top of the charts for ages. I mean, it was very, you know, I was very naive about the whole thing, and I think actually that was quite good. I think that was quite good. Although after now the pressure to, you know, when you've had success with your first book, it's very difficult after with the subsequent books, and you're always hoping that you can one day write a novel that will meet the expectations of everybody and be another Behind Closed Doors.
I think that's a challenge for a lot of writers. If you have one book that flies, whether it's your first, third or eighth, I think the pressure is heaped on, and particularly in publishing timetables and that kind of thing. I try and write a book a year, and that's a toughie. So I think a lot of us feel that. The Therapist was so good in terms of, well, lots of reasons, but one of the things I loved is it recreated that sort of claustrophobia that you had in Behind Closed Doors. Can you talk a bit about The Therapist? Tell the people watching a little bit about it.
Yes, The Therapist, actually, it came about because we moved back from France a couple of years ago into an old cottage, and after a while I began thinking about the people who had lived there before. And I thought, well, a lot of people must have died in this cottage, because, you know, a few hundred years ago, nobody really went to hospital to die. And I was quite happy living with their ghosts. And then one day I just thought, well, what if I found out that one of them had been murdered? And if they'd been murdered recently, like the person who'd lived in the house before us. And I thought, well, that's a really good idea. It gives me a good starting point for a novel. And I decided to set it in this claustrophobic setting because, well, I think most thrillers work only if there's not that many characters. You know, and I love this idea of everybody watching everybody else. And so one of my daughters lives in London, and I'd passed a kind of a gated residence like that, although it was flats, it was a block of flats, and there was this imposing black gate that you could see through. And I thought, oh yeah, they could all be looking through each other's windows and seeing what goes on with their neighbours. And I thought that was a really good setting. So, you know, I wanted that.
Brilliant setting. Yeah, and in the book it's called The Circle, which I absolutely love because that just sort of sums up that. It reminded me of sort of the old panopticon prisons, the idea that part of the punishment was that somebody could always see you. So I thought that was fantastic. And I was watching a talk, in fact, a Poison Pen interview between Dennis Lehane and Gillian Flynn, and he said something, Dennis Lehane said, "We all make our own prison bars," which was a phrase that really stuck with me. And I think this is something that happens in The Circle, because your main character, Alice, she's got a new relationship, a new home. She moves into the circle with this new man, and starts to discover that the house holds a secret, and starts to mistrust her neighbors. And you do this brilliantly as it unfolds. We don't know who to trust. She meets a lot of different people, things happen, there's stuff going on in the house. But one of the things I was sort of, it kept coming up, is I kept wanting to sort of yell at her, you know, leave, you've got to leave. And I think one of the things you did really well was show that sometimes we make really bad decisions because we're sort of obsessed, or we feel like we have to follow something to its bitter end to figure it out. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about Alice and why she kind of can't let go, and why she gets deeper into this terribly first claustrophobic and then frightening situation. Just sort of generally, no spoilers, but this sort of characteristic we have.
Well, I think, you know, if she had upped and left, there wouldn't have been a story. So I had to make her stay there, and I had to give her this obsession with trying to find out what had happened to the person who had lived there before. And so I gave her this backstory with her sister, because I thought that actually lent, you know, gave her this reason, because, you know, Alice can come across as very annoying. She's quite, you know, she mistrusts everybody. She's you know, paranoid. She and yes, in a way, she should have left. I mean, I would leave if I suddenly found out, you know, it's an interesting thing, but she decides to stay, even though she doesn't even like the house. So she has this obsession, you know, with getting to the truth. And, but I think, you know, in all thrillers, there has to be a degree of obsession for it to work. You know, you have to become obsessed with something. There has to be somebody trying to get to the truth, whether it's about somebody they live with, or about something that's happened, or about a neighbor. So basically, you know, it's just a variation on the same theme.
Yeah, and I love it when that obsession, as it does so well in so many thrillers, turns into something that just escalates the threat that's already there. So I think that was absolutely brilliant in the book. It was a tough and frightening situation. It just got magnified by Alice's personality. It was great. It was fantastic.
Well, it does. But Gilly, let me add, don't you think it's very human that we don't want to revisit or review our decisions easily? You know, if we've made one, we don't particularly want to think it was a bad one until things get to an intolerable point. So I could understand Alice, who gave up her, you know, she loved where she lived, and, you know, she agreed to make this move and commit to this guy and the whole bit. And it's very hard to go back on that once you've done that. I mean, you know, I was an attorney for a long time, and one of the things I knew about divorce is that people generally stayed in way too long. And the reaction of most people once they were divorced was, you know, why did it take me so long? Why didn't I walk away from this sooner? But there's a whole weight of, you know, responsibilities. If you have children, it's harder, you know, which Alice does not. So that's a really good thing, because what if she'd moved? I thought about that, Bernadette, you know, what if she'd had a child and, you know, moved them both into the circle? That would have presented a whole different, or at least an accelerated situation. And I think women, I don't want to sound sexist, but we're all women here, so I can say this. I think women have a harder time saying I made a mistake. I think guys walk away more easily.
I think I agree. In domestic situations, particularly, I think women tend to double down. And there's the whole sunk cost fallacy. You know, I've put in so much. Surely there's going to be a return for me, emotionally, or, you know, practical terms.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So the actual, you know, we could look at, let's say, Death on the Nile, because most people maybe have read Agatha Christie's book, or the movie, seen the movie, or whatever it is. And it's not that different. You know, the circle is not that different than, in fact, the boat. And, you know, the people on the boat, just like the residents of the circle, when you're in a closed community like that, and you have to navigate it, you have to either trust or mistrust or dive overboard, or, you know, whatever it is you're going to do. It's a wonderful form, I think, for exploring human nature. Bernadette, was that part of your, your enthusiasm for constructing the circle, was to really do a deep dive into the psyches of these characters, their personalities?
Yes, absolutely. I love the relationship between the women, and I haven't had that many. I think there were quite a lot of characters in this book compared to my other novels, but I really wanted them to come to life. Eve and Tamsin, her neighbours, who who are best friends, and she's desperately trying to make friends with them. And I wanted to give those two as well stories, quite interesting. Eve had a less interesting story, but there was a lot of mystery about Tamsin and her relationship with her husband. And I did like delving into that and why she was so protective of Nina, who was her best friend. So I really enjoyed writing these characters. Yeah, I really enjoyed writing the three characters. It's the first time I've done three characters together like that. And I thought it really worked well for me as a writer. It was interesting.
I think there's a bit of a national divide between Americans who tend to be confessional and clingy, and British who find a virtue in keeping oneself to oneself, which is really a hard concept for most Americans to grasp. But I do think that because that there is this tendency to respect privacy and keep oneself to oneself, that things can be more claustrophobic in a lot of British mystery than you might find in American. Would you agree with that, either one of you, or do you want to say I'm just nuts?
No, I absolutely agree on that. I think we do have this, we don't like to intrude. And I know that from moving into this village 2 years ago, where there were already established relationships. I could see that. So of course I used my experience a little bit in my book, but everybody has been really welcoming. But I was very aware when I moved into the village that I didn't want to go and be too forward and too friendly and say, hey, I'm going to be your new best friend, And so, yes, we're much more reserved, I think, much more aware of boundaries. So it probably is quite maybe strange for Americans reading this book and realizing how, because Alice is quite reticent. She wants to put herself forward, but she's also very aware of the friendships that are already established.
I love the scenes where she first arrived and she's peering out the window at these women and overhearing scraps of their conversations. And I think you got that feeling of being an outsider, which you can sometimes get in communities in this country really, really well. And I would agree totally with what you said, Barbara. We are pretty private here.
Well, you are, but the interesting opposite of that is that I think you're all more attuned to social niceties. I mean, to the right form, so to speak. I mean, if I live in a gated community, it's not actually that dissimilar, Bernadette. Although Phoenix is mostly like suburbs knitted together. A lot of it was formed on ranches that were acquired one by one, and so it's not urban like London, but nevertheless, we have a lot of gated communities here. And we wouldn't think anything of either completely ignoring our neighbors, which is what my husband and I generally do because we work all the time, or popping over without an invitation, with a casserole or, a bottle of wine or whatever it might be. But it seemed to me Alice really felt a need to have some sort of formal introduction, right? She has a need to have that party and do it correctly and invite people, which is where, the first intrusion occurs. And I think there's a respect for form that we don't necessarily share. I often wonder why Americans like to read British mystery so much. So, some of it is that, there are a lot of things that are really different, even if we have a common language, and even that isn't very common. But did you take advantage of that? Why was she compelled to have the party?
I think that's what a lot of people do here when you move in somewhere. If you want to get to know people, it's quite, I think in the States, people throw a party for you often, to welcome the new person into the neighborhood maybe. But I got a feeling in England, it's not like that at all. And I felt that, if we wanted to get to know, because I was going to throw a party, and that's where I got the idea for the intruder coming in, because I thought, what if somebody turned up who hadn't been invited? I never did throw the party, but what I did was invite people around in little groups for drinks. And I had to make that first step before people started inviting us back, you know. So it's completely different. I mean, we would never go round to somebody's uninvited with a bottle of wine, somebody we didn't know or hardly knew. You know, it's just very different, I think.
I just reread one of my favorite Georgette Hare novels. I can actually quote most of them verbatim. But one of the things, you know, that is so clear when you're reading, for example, a Regency novel, is that there were very definite time limits. You know, if you made a morning call, there was, I can't remember, but, you know, nobody stayed, let's call it half an hour for lack of anything else. So it was very, very strict about, you know, you would present your card, but you would go and you would have this long to stay, and then, you know, proper form, you would move on. And so I often see that difference also in reading British social settings, where people are expected to come for drinks, but they also expect to stay for like X amount of time. They're not there when the midnight hour sounds, you know, they go in and they have a drink and they know it's like whatever it is, 90 minutes or something, and then they leave. So there's a certain amount of rules that kind of govern how all those things work, which I think would make it easier as a hostess, you know, because you too would know what to expect. You wouldn't be thinking, do I have enough things on the shelf to make a tuna casserole in case everybody's still here at 11? Well, I mean, you know, it's sort of fun to explore those differences.
Even among European countries, because coming back from France, there, if you invite people for a drink, you would do quite a lot of food for people to have. They wouldn't have to go home and have dinner. So, but in England, I would invite people around and do this, loads of food, and nobody would eat anything because it was just for a drink. So then it really is just for a drink. So it was quite hard adapting. So yeah, I think, you know, there's lots of customs that come with countries.
There are. Gilly, why don't you tell us a little bit about your most recent book?
Oh, so my most recent novel is called To Tell You the Truth, and it's about a crime writer. And she is called Lucy Harper, and Lucy had a very difficult thing happen to her as a child. She snuck out to the woods one night to witness the summer solstice party, and she took her little brother Teddy, and Teddy never came home. And Lucy was questioned by her parents and by police, and she came up with a different story every time about what happened to him. And so in the novel, we meet Lucy years later. She's in her 30s. She's a very, very successful writer. She's spun that storytelling ability into a career. And we meet her as her husband goes missing. And so the book really kicks off from there. But there's one more interesting thing about her, which is that she's a very successful novelist. She has a character who reappears in her novels who's a detective. But for Lucy, this character was born out of her childhood friend. And so she's far more present in Lucy's life than a character in a book should be.
Well, I hope it wasn't autobiographical.
No. Well, you know, I thought this is going to be a terrific book to write because there's no research. I know what crime writers do, all that. But I actually, after the initial euphoria, found it difficult because it was creepy. It was creepy taking a life I recognize and making it, and sort of thrillerizing it, if that word makes sense, just twisting it in directions that are scary. So I slightly regretted it after a while.
I loved that you took a writer. I just thought it was brilliant because it was a brave thing to do, to have your main character as a writer and a crime writer, a writer of thrillers. And I just thought that was really brave. And some things, yes, I found myself thinking, yeah, I do that. Or yes, you know, I mean, it was recognizable. So I can imagine for you actually writing it, you probably didn't want to give too much of yourself away thinking, are people going to think this is me? I don't know how you felt writing that because, you know, it was very brave, as I say.
I did feel a little bit cagey. Interestingly, I've noticed there's a ton of new books out about writers like The Plot. I know I've read another one recently. So there seems to be something in the water, like crime writers writing about crime writers and writers writing about writers, which are books I enjoy. I was also trying to do an unreliable narrator. That was a goal for me because I love reading those sorts of books.
Well, you're right. There has been a kind of tsunami of books about writers. I have an Australian author. We sold Poison Pen Press a couple of years ago, but I have continued to edit her, and she has a book coming out that I think next year will be a really interesting one, and metafiction kind of with writers. But there have been a lot. The Plot was a wonderful book.
Yeah, it was great.
I really enjoyed interviewing Jean, who is not a crime writer. That's the funny part. You know, the book has kind of taken her by surprise because her previous books, I think she had one that was sort of crimey, but, you know, not. So there's another interesting one called Who is Maud Dixon? That is yet, you know, another variation on that.
And,
but that leads me to a question, Bernadette, and also for Gilly. Every time you write a standalone, you have to do world building. You know, you're not taking a series and carrying forward a world that you created in an original book. Why does that appeal to you, Bernadette, as compared to, you know, possibly writing a series? And I'm not in any way saying one's better than the other. It's just, you know, how it works.
I'm not capable of writing a detective novel. And I think, you know, if it's a series, it's usually a detective at the heart of it. So I just couldn't do that. I think police procedural is very difficult for me to write. I wouldn't be able to do that. I prefer my standard novels, and I just, you know, by the time I get to the end of my novel, I've already started thinking about my next book, and I can't wait to get started on that. So, you know, I'm quite happy saying goodbye now. I've put you out in the world, or you're going to be in the world soon. And I think I wouldn't cope well with having a character that I had to carry on writing for years and years and years. To develop a character, and people do it so well, but I think I'd have trouble developing a character and finding new things to tell the reader about that character each time. So the idea really enthralls you. You know, you have an idea and you want to pursue it. And of course, the problem with the series is that everything you already wrote has to come forward, and it can prevent you from doing some really interesting plots if it doesn't fit the characters that you created or their landscape. Gilly, what about you? Because you're also a person who seems to like to create new worlds.
Yeah, I actually did take one character through from my debut into my third novel. So I took the detective into Odd Child Out. He was also in What She Knew. And at first, again, I was very pleased because I thought he's fully formed. I know everything about him. I'm slotting him into a new case, and this is terrific. But what I discovered was that I lost a little flexibility because if I thought, oh, I can do this with this story, or this would be a terrific thing to happen, then I thought the next thought would be, oh, but that doesn't work for Jim. Because Jim is this personality. And so after a while, I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to do this again, because I would like to be able to, I like my characters to be quite malleable in a first draft, so I can take the story where I think it's most exciting, and then I can go back and develop them more so that all feels convincing. I know who they are, but I want a little bit of flexibility.
So Bernadette, this is your fifth book. They've all been wonderful. They've all been different. Is part of the fun of writing individual thrillers that everybody in them is at risk? I mean, in the end, you know, if you really wanted to, you could kill off your narrator. You can't do it in a series. You know, we always know when we're reading a series that the series lead is going to survive. But when you pick up a thriller, you know, everyone in it is at risk. Is that part of the appeal? Yeah, the appeal for me in writing thrillers is I love playing with the idea. I love plotting and thinking of ways that, not that I don't want to trick my reader, but I want to make it really interesting for my reader. So I want to put all these little false clues in, but quite subtly, so they think that they've picked up something. And yeah, that's what I really enjoy about, you know, especially, I mean, I had such fun writing The Therapist because I had quite a good cast of characters, and I could actually make the reader as well suspect nearly everybody. And that's the feedback I've had from people that have read it, that they really ended up suspecting everybody and not knowing who the real person was. Or if they had suspected, there was still another twist at the end. So I do love that. I love kind of trying to find ways to make my books, I suppose it's just making them a really interesting read as much as I can.
Do you plot it all out in advance, or do you feel your way through it?
No, not at all. I don't make any notes whatsoever. I don't ever use, pencil and paper to write anything down. But I think I probably plot a little bit in my head, because before I start writing, I'm thinking about a new idea for a story and where it might go. So I always know my beginning, and then I'll know the end I want to get to. And that has never changed, really. I've always managed to get to the end I wanted to achieve. But the middle bit's kind of a journey. And I really like that, because, I might have one or two waypoints, a couple of plot things that I've thought about. But getting to those, and sometimes they change, but honestly, I just start writing from my opening scene and see what happens. But I couldn't do it any other way. I've tried to plot. An author friend actually sent me her spreadsheet very kindly so that I could see, because she couldn't see how I could do it without plotting. And I couldn't understand what she meant by plotting everything out. And it was literally, chapter 1, he says this, she says that. At the end of the chapter, this happens, chapter 2. And I just thought, but how could I do that? Because I don't know what's going to happen in chapter 2 until I write chapter 1. But, I find it fascinating. I think plotters find it fascinating how we do it, but I find it fascinating that people can plot. And know, and plot. And actually, by the time they write their manuscript, their first draft, they know exactly where the story's going. So they probably don't edit as much as people like me do. And I don't know about you, Gillian. What do you do, Gilly?
Oh, exactly the same as you. I start with a wing and a prayer and a first line, and off I go. And I have to. I can't imagine doing it any other way. I rather aspire to be a plotter, but it's just a grey mist in my head when I try to think that way. I think my brain's built wrong for that kind of thing. I wanted to ask you about writing about. It's kind of leading on from what Barbara said about how brilliantly you've done these characters, because quite a few of your books look right into marriage or relationships, like the breakdown and behind closed doors. And I wanted to ask you if how you find that doing that deep dive into couples, because I think I love the creepy things that can be unveiled, the sort of showing how little we might know somebody we're with, which is a particularly interesting theme in The Therapist.
Well, I love writing about relationships, whether it's between couples, husbands and wives, or whatever partners, but even between children as well. In The Dilemma, I wrote about the relationship as well between the two children with their parents, Marnie and Josh. And I really find that interesting. And in fact, when I set out to write novels, all the novels that I wrote that haven't been published are all what I would call family dramas. And I never set out to write thrillers at all. And it was just when Behind Closed Doors was published, everybody called it a thriller. And in fact, an agent had told me that although I could write, my books weren't right for the market. And when I asked what was right for the market, they told me psychological thrillers. And I remember saying, I will never write a psychological thriller, because I actually didn't know what that meant. And I wrote Behind Closed Doors, and people said, oh, it's a great psychological thriller. So of course, I had to write more. So basically, I just wrote the family drama that I wanted to write, but then put this thriller element in it where there was either, lots of suspicion or a death or something. So I think, what I really want to write and what I really enjoy writing is exactly that, the relationship book, the family drama.
I think that makes some of the best thrillers, when you've got rich characters and it's just laid over a mystery plot. I think you can get, and that's one of the beautiful things about crime fiction, isn't it? That it goes in so many different directions and can take these deep dives for character.
And I think it's a very broad umbrella, for sure. I'm sorry, Bernadette, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, people love reading about other people's relationships. I mean, I think we all want to know what goes on, even when we look at our friends, our couple, the couple, we always wonder, are they really like they are all the time? I think people are always interested, and we want to see failings and other flaws rather than failings in other people, because we're all flawed. And some people present, this perfect couple, this aura of being everything's perfect in their lives. And, I just like to look below the surface and see what's there.
Social media has, I think, increased that desire, for us to have, for people to have more glamorous or better lives. There have been a number of books that have come out in the last few months where, the role of Instagram and other sorts of social media has had a serious effect on people's behavior, or it incites envy or jealousy or feelings of inferiority. That why isn't my life as gorgeous and glamorous as that person's life? And it does, but listening to both of you, the thriller is really the perfect form for you. It'd be extremely difficult to write a detective story if you had if you were just like winging it. It's a more logical form. But the great thing about a thriller is it's so expansive. Thrillers move across a landscape. Thrillers are really about opposition. You have a protagonist and one or more antagonists, and it is a form that I think allows you to explore things much more broadly than if you're writing a more traditional mystery. And that the domestic thriller, the psychological thriller, is an interesting branch of it. We do a lot of military fiction, a lot of events with, spies saving the world, or, they tend to be more men than women who are starring in those kinds of books. But I love the fact that the thriller can embrace all of that. And in fact, if you think about it, the first unreliable narrator was actually probably the one I can recall is in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah.
Which, and then Scott Turow and I had a really interesting discussion when we launched his book last year, and I pointed out to him that Presumed Innocent was a classic of the unreliable narrator. I remember people, as I said to Scott, I can remember customers standing at the checkout counter at the bookstore and arguing over who did it and what actually happened at the end of Presumed Innocent, and I thought, wow, he did a really ace job here. If people gotten to the end and they still don't know for sure, or they don't agree on how it came out. So it's not that it's a brand new form, but people like Gillian and Paula Hawkins and so forth, gave it a big kickstart back in 2011. And you said, Jilly, that you watched Dennis and Gillian. That was a really interesting interview, wasn't it? And, I thought where they discussed how difficult it was or not difficult, they discussed what it was like to have a mega seller and then what to do in its wake.
Yeah,
how do you do that?
Yeah, which is partly behind my question earlier to Bernadette. What kind of pressures do you feel? I mean, their conversation was so open and honest and fascinating, and I thought they got down to some of the bones of writing, really, which was really, really, really nice to watch. Highly recommend.
Well, I did too. We actually had 60,000 people watching it, which is the highest total so far that we've had. But I think it was fueled by, by word of mouth, that people were so interested in what they had to say that they recommended. It's one thing, that Zoom has brought to us is the opportunity to have conversations that can have a vast audience. We love having live events at the Poison Pen, and we've done it forever, but inevitably it's limited to the number of people there, which is why like 20 years ago, we started videoing all of our events in the store. We started videoing them direct to Facebook. So Zoom is just a better technology as far as we're concerned. It didn't actually change anything that we've been doing. But I really have loved watching the audience and the international audience growing. I mean, what was it? Patrick and I were doing something the other day, and out of the blue, and a totally unexpected viewer, given the nature of the book, and I don't remember what it was a question from Zimbabwe. And I really blinked, because I thought, what are the odds that a person from Zimbabwe would be interested in what was a very American conversation or whatever. So maybe that's just me being closed-minded, but anyway, it's been wonderful to experience that. Bernadette, how many languages are your books now translated into, and have you read any? Are you a fluent French speaker?
Yes, I am. So I always read the French translation just to make sure that I agree, because there are some things, actually, surprisingly enough, that are lost in translation, and which I was quite surprised that some translators don't pick it up. For example, I think it was in the breakdown, when she's worried, my heroine Cass is worried about men in white, oh gosh, I can't remember the word in English now, coming to take away, meaning, to a psychiatric unit. And it was just translated as men in white shirts and coming to take away. And it didn't have the same meaning at all. in French. You know, it just didn't work. And of course I had to point that out and find how they would say that in French. So it's interesting to read my books usually the translation is brilliant, you know, it's brilliant. 99.9% of it is brilliant. Sometimes I pick up a couple of little things, but Behind Closed Doors has now been translated into 40 languages, which is amazing.
40 languages, that is astonishing. Wow.
Yeah, I just got the 40th not long ago. So that's a really nice achievement. And what is even more lovely.
Which language was the 40th? Which language was the 40th?
It was, do you know, I can't remember. I was going to say something like, I thought it was Estonian, but I think I've had one since I think that was probably the 38th or 39th. It's quite hard to keep track, but my agent keeps me up to date on them. So, and I get a copy usually of each translation, which is really nice. I'm missing a few Behind Closed Doors, maybe because they haven't come out in that country yet, which is, you know, this is funny with Behind Closed Doors. It came out 5 years ago and it's still now just being translated maybe into language for the first time. So it definitely has staying power, that book.
It's often difficult to find a qualified translator. I once did a fascinating event with a translator for, who was it? Camilla Lackberg, I think. And it turned out by sheer accident that the man who lived in New Mexico, you wouldn't think this, and his wife, we had been students at Stanford together. And yet, you know, their expertise was in translating Swedish. And it turned out that he or she, I can't remember which one, not only did Camilla, but had done The Girl in the Dragon Tattoo and the other books for Quercus. And from that, I was able to discover how translators work. I mean, how they're paid, you know, what stake they have in the book. It's quite different than, you know, than an author with escalating royalties and so forth. Translators work for generally they're paid by the word or by their time. I can't remember what it is, but it's largely a flat fee. So he didn't get rich off the success of The Girl and the Dragon Tattoo franchise, which, you know, was a surprise. But now I know there are prizes for translators. There are, you know, prizes for best translation, which I think is a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
That,
I think,
you know, not just the author, but the translator, if you're looking at other countries, gets credit. So why don't we call Patrick up and see, this is where he comes back from the dark depths there. He always has great questions of his own. Where is he? There he is.
There I am. All right, let's see. Okay, we have somebody tuning in from India today.
Oh, good.
Yeah, super appreciate that the Poison Pen allows non-Phoenicians to attend too. Of course we do. Let's see, as far as questions, yeah, I do have one. Jackie asks, if you could pick your favorite flawed character that you've written, who would you choose and why?
Oh gosh, this is such a hard one. But for me, it would be Jack in Behind Closed Doors, because he was just so interesting to write, and because it was such an interesting experience writing him, because I often felt that he took over. And, you know, I always write one day and the next morning I'll go through and read what I wrote. And sometimes I would say, I don't remember writing that. Where did that come from? And he completely, you know, I never expected to write a book with such an evil character. I didn't expect him or want him particularly to be that evil, but it was as if he was pushing me and saying, no, I can be worse than that, you know, I'm going to be worse than that. So I think he'd be my favorite flawed character. It's probably a terrible thing to say, as he was just such an evil person, but there we are.
How about you, Shelley?
It's a character I can't talk about because it's in the book I've just finished. So I'm going to plump for Lucy Harper, who's the writer I was speaking about in my novel, to tell you the truth, because Lucy's flaw is this inability to tell the difference between truth and fiction. And that was just fascinating to write, see how that affected her life and her decisions.
I have another question, which is just a fairly broad one, which is, do you have any tips for aspiring writers?
Yeah, my tip would be to start writing and, you know, just keep at it, because if you've really got that burning ambition and you've got that kind of gut feeling, you know, that you're going to make it, well, just hang on to that and be prepared for lots of rejection and hard work, because there are very few authors who make it straight away on their first novel. So it might be that, you know, you write a novel, it's rejected, but definitely don't despair. You just have to pick yourself up and write another one and just keep hammering away at it until you get it right. That's the advice I would give. Just don't give up if it's something you really want to do. Never give up on your dream.
My advice would be to read widely, to read as much as you can, to pay attention to how books work. And just, yeah, read, because that's your training and that's how you improve your craft.
It's a corollary question, Bernadette, since you had written other novels, have you found that any parts of them, any particular, you know, chunks thereof, can make their way into a book that you have just written or are working on?
Not the ones I wrote before I was published. I really like those books. They're very precious to me. As I say, they're family dramas, and who knows, one day if I go back and maybe work a lot on them, because I'm sure if I read them now I'd be quite appalled. You know, but I did love my characters in those books, and I would like to think that maybe one day they might, you know, come to life on page. But you know, sometimes when I'm thinking about my next book, I might start writing something and then I think, well, actually, that's not working. I'm not sure where that book's going to go. That story's going to go. So I'll drop it after maybe 20 or 30,000 words. So I often think of maybe amalgamating 2 of those to make another story. And sometimes I think I will be able to use some of it in a book.
Are you under pressure to, I mean, are you contracted to produce a book a year, or can you take more time if you wish?
Well, for example, normally it's a book a year, but this year I've asked for a little break this summer because there's a lot going on. And actually I caught COVID and I was quite ill with it, so that kind of set me back a bit, and I'm perfectly all right now, but you know, it did kind of exhaust me for a couple of months, so I have asked for a little bit of a delay, and my publishers have been great about it. My editors have been great, just saying, yeah, take a couple of months, you know, if my deadline is moved 2 months on, it's not a problem. So, but other than that, yes, I mean, I will have another book coming out next year, definitely. I've done the first draft, I'm working on the second draft. So I do like to keep to that rhythm of a book a year while I can, but it is quite a lot. You know, it's quite
a lot, right? No, I agree. I think sometimes some authors thrive under that kind of pressure and deadline, and some authors find it pretty crushing. So just depends on your own. What about you, Gilly? What is your pace?
I've been on a similar book a year pace, and I think I thrived on it for probably the first 5 or 6 books, but I struggled with the last one, which is my 7th. So for the first time, I'm not having a book come out in the fall this year, but it'll come out next spring, because I just suddenly hit a wall and needed a bit of extra time, which was wonderful, and the publishers were super understanding. So I don't know how it'll go from now. I'm hoping the save time will let me pick up the pace again. We'll see.
Andrew, anything else?
Let's see. Greg asks, what types of books do you both like to read? Any favorite authors?
This is a tricky one because I should say psychological thrillers, but they're not my go-to book. Again, I love reading family dramas. I like reading Ken Follett, all his huge books. That's the sort of thing I like reading for pleasure. Don't often get the chance because, like Gilly, who probably has a TBR pile as big as mine, we get a lot of books to read, and they're all psychological thrillers. So I spend a lot of time reading psychological thrillers.
I definitely read thrillers for the same reason as Bernadette, and because it's nice to know what's happening in the market. And I have some favorites who I always, you know, when their new book comes out, I'm all over that. But I also try to read really widely as well. I read literary fiction, historical fiction, non-fiction, because I think anything I read is doing me some good, and actually it's probably helping me kind of develop within my genre to have those extra influences.
It's hard. I think Patrick and I can both agree. When reading is your job, it's different than when you can just read what you like. I like it because I've ended up reading many things that I probably would have passed up, given my own, given my own choice. But sometimes I admit I get frustrated when I see a book. I have to pace myself every month, and it's a reward system. If I do this much, then I can read that book that I really want to read. And so I keep bribing myself. Patrick, how's that work for you? Because you read enormously as well.
Same thing. Yeah, I mean, there's so many books that come out that I would just love to be able to devote that nice chunk of time to read, but then that chunk of time never seems to materialize.
And this is, yeah, this
I
has
just
been a
find-
bizarre year because so many books were postponed from
Yes.
2020. So there's probably, what, at least 20% more publishing in 2021
Yeah.
than did, you know, because of all the postponements and all. So it's been particularly crushing. When I go away, I have to have somebody here at the house who just takes in books every day. I mean, literally, because they arrive at the door and, you know, pile up.
You know, it's interesting. The other day we had a program with a nonfiction, you know, the devil, you know, I think was the name of the book. It was written by a British, I think she's a forensic psychologist, maybe, named Dr. Gwen Adshead, and then an American co-writer, Eileen Horn. And it was fascinating. The book is a kind of a compendium of case studies. I think the subtitle was, you know, they're talking about compassion and cruelty and things like that. And we got into a really interesting discussion about the shadow side, you know, and what are all of us capable of doing if under the right amount of stress, the right circumstances, you know. And of course, and the author is a huge crime fiction reader. And so we got into a very interesting discussion about crime fiction and how it does a great job of studying this, you know, from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to Val McDermott today, you know. Does that issue interest both of you, you know, the shadow side of our personalities?
Definitely. I think, you know, if you're a thriller writer, you are interested in exploring the dark side that we all have. Everybody has a dark side. So yes, definitely. I don't know about Gilly, but
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the exciting things about writing domestic suspense is that you can take a regular family setup or marriage setup and then hit it with a lightning bolt, you know, to sort of explode it. And that's the moment you start to explore what people might be capable of doing.
Let's see here. Okay. Jackie asks, how many books do each of you read in a month on average? Oh boy.
I don't know really. I mean, if I'm editing, I won't read anything because I just don't have the time. You know, and we all have busy lives as well, I think, you know, so for example, I have elderly parents that I need, you know, looking after a bit. So I don't have as much time to read as I would like, especially when I'm editing. So I might only read one book a month when I'm editing. When I'm kind of taking a break between books, then it might be 2 or 3, maybe 4. I can read a book a week, you know, but yeah, it's a good question because I've never really thought about it in the terms of quantity.
I'm probably similar. I mean, it's cyclical how much demand a novel demands your time. But if I've got a bit of time off and nothing else dragging at me, I could read a book every couple of days. But that's rare. Usually it's probably 3 or 4 a month, something like that.
Probably a better question for both of you would be, how many words do you write in a month versus how many do you read? That's an impossible question, I'm sure, but
it is. I think it's just, I do see authors who, you know, they have a target of say 2,000 words a day or, you know, 3,000 words a day, and they try and hit that. They say, you know, I'll do this and then I'll have lunch, but I won't have lunch until I've written 1,000 words. And I never do that. I mean, because I can literally spend all day writing and come out with maybe a page at the end of it because I'll be editing it and trying to get it exactly right. But then other days it will just flow and I'll write thousands of words. So it's really, I don't do a word, I don't try and meet a target of words. I think, I don't think that serves any purpose, not for me personally anyway.
Yeah, I'm similar these days. Because I kind of have a sense of where the book needs to be at certain times to hit my deadline. But I will say that when I wrote my debut, and I was a very busy mum of children, and I said I'd write 1,000 words a day until I had a book, because my challenge to myself was, can you write a book? So I did do that. I mean, I didn't do it every day, but I had a little piece of paper on the wall and I'd write down how many words I wrote that day until it hit 100,000. And it was terrible, but it was there as something I could work with.
I saw somebody online, I can't remember which author it was, but they had a dry erase board behind them. and they put in the date and then the word count each day. I thought that was kind of a neat idea. We have a good friend of ours, Hank Philippi Ryan, is watching, and he has a couple of good, just really good standard questions. Have you always wanted to write, and do you write every day?
So I always wanted to write, and do I write every day? I used to write every day, but at the moment there's times when I can't write. So I will go a few days without writing, and now I've gone quite a while without writing. So, but I'm quite cool about it. I know that I'll be able to get back into it. It's just there's other things that are priority at the moment. So yeah, I'd love to write every day. Most times I do, and I often write during the night if I haven't written during the day. So I don't know whether Gilly, you're a nighttime writer like me if you wake up in the small hours.
No, I'm a morning person, so I'd be more likely to kind of write from 7 a.m. onwards. I don't write every day. I probably should, but some days it's just better to not. If you're fighting with it, it's better to walk away and rest your mind. And generally that works very well and you can come back the next day. But I'm pretty disciplined overall.
Do you think that the story is actually in the incubator all the time doing its work?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Sometimes I don't want it to be. I'd rather have a clearer head. But yeah, especially toward the end of a novel, it's very present.
Yeah, we should probably ask the inevitable question we get, which is there been any film interest in either of your books?
For mine, for Behind Closed Doors, yeah, it's right from the beginning. It was, the rights were optioned for a film. That was 5 years ago, and I'm still waiting. So, things are, it's not easy. I mean, my agent warned me. She said, doesn't mean to say that your book will ever be made into a film. The rights have been optioned, but there's so many things that come into play, like finding the right director, the right actors and actresses, the finance. So there's been quite a few setbacks, but I'm still hoping because I think it will make a great film. So yeah, I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that one.
Yeah, a couple of mine have been optioned, the detective novels. Oh, in fact, yeah, 3 of them, but just options. So I'm not holding my breath. It would be great if it happened.
Well, there's no question that COVID has really held up a great many possible filmings and so forth. And I think this year has been such a wealth of books. We may in the next couple of years have an extra rush of, long form television in particular, probably more than movies. So, and that's distracting. I mean, I really have gotten into some of these long form storytelling television. At the end of the day, when I'm just exhausted, I'm too tired to read sometimes. And so we formed a habit of watching various things, and it gets addictive. It really is a big time suck, but at the same time, it's really fascinating if you know the books. It's fascinating to see how the different platform and the different interpretations of it, the book is still the book, but the film can take on a life of its own. And that's, I think, really interesting. I've read some dull books that have made great television, and I've seen some bad television made from really good books. So, it's not like always a perfect transition, is it? But it's fun. Anything else there, Patrick?
Looks like that's just about it.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank both of you. It's been an enthralling conversation. I want to remind you that The Therapist is Bernadette's brand new book, actually brand new in July. And we still have copies for it at the store, and we can continue to order them. And Gilly's books, we have a whole row of them. So if you don't know these authors, here's your chance to become acquainted. Ladies, thank you so much for meeting each other and for joining us. It's really been an absolute treat. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.